I have spent my entire life being the person who catches everyone else when they fall. In our family, that was just the unspoken rule. My brother Liam was the dreamer, the one who took risks, and the one who inevitably crashed. My parents would call me, their voices trembling with a rehearsed kind of panic, and I would pull out my checkbook or my calendar to fix whatever mess had been made. I never complained. I thought that was what it meant to be a brother. I thought that love was a ledger where you never actually expected to be paid back, as long as the people you cared about stayed upright. Then came the day the doctor sat us down and told us Liam's kidneys were failing. It wasn't a slow decline that we could prepare for. It was a sudden, terrifying drop-off. Within weeks, my vibrant, athletic brother was a ghost of himself, tethered to a dialysis machine that drained his spirit just as much as it filtered his blood. The air in my parents' house changed. It became thick with the scent of antiseptic and desperation. I watched my mother age a decade in a single month. I watched my father stare at the wall, paralyzed by the realization that he couldn't protect his golden boy from his own biology. I didn't even wait for them to ask. I think that was my first mistake. I walked into the transplant coordinator's office and told them I wanted to be tested. I didn't care about the risks. I didn't care about the fact that I was basically signing away a piece of my own longevity. When the results came back as a near-perfect match, I remember feeling a strange sense of pride. I was going to be the one to save him. I was going to be the hero our family needed. The testing process was a grueling marathon of blood draws, psychological evaluations, and physical stress tests that left me exhausted. But I pushed through it all with a smile. I told myself that my discomfort was a small price to pay for Liam's future. The night before the surgery, I sat by my mother in the hospital cafeteria. She was crying, thanking me over and over, telling me I was the best son a woman could ask for. I remember looking her straight in the eyes and saying, I didn't just give him a kidney, Mom. I gave him the next 40 years of his life. I meant it. I wanted her to understand the weight of the sacrifice, not because I wanted praise, but because I wanted her to know that Liam was going to be okay. I was literally putting my body on the line to ensure our family stayed whole. The surgery itself is a blur of cold lights and the sharp smell of iodine. I remember the scratchy sensation of the oxygen mask, and the way the anesthesia felt like a heavy, dark curtain falling over my mind. When I woke up, the pain was a white-hot roar in my side. Every breath felt like a jagged blade was twisting in my abdomen. But through the fog of the painkillers, the first thing I asked the nurse was how Liam was doing. When she told me the kidney had started working immediately, I wept with relief. I spent the next week in a hospital bed, clutching a pillow to my stomach every time I had to cough, watching Liam's color return and his strength grow. I felt like I had fulfilled my purpose. Recovery was slow. I moved back into my apartment, hobbling around and struggling to even lift a gallon of milk. I was tired, but I was happy. Liam was thriving. He was back on his feet, planning his future with Chloe, and talking about how this second chance had changed his perspective on everything. He told me he owed me everything. He told me he'd never forget what I did. For 2 months we were closer than we had ever been. The family was healed. The crisis was over. Everything seemed perfect until 2 months post-op, when a save-the-date arrived in the mail, but my name was nowhere on the guest list. I stared at the thick, cream-colored cardstock of the invitation for a long time, turning it over as if a hidden flap might reveal my name. It didn't. I assumed it was a clerical error, a simple oversight caused by the chaotic stress of wedding planning. I drove over to Liam's place, still moving with that stiff, protective hunch people have when their internal stitches haven't fully settled into their new reality. My side throbbed, a dull reminder of the literal piece of me currently keeping Liam's heart beating. When I walked in, Chloe was surrounded by bridal magazines and fabric swatches that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage. Liam was on the sofa, looking healthier than I'd seen him in years. His skin had a glow that I had paid for in blood and bone. I set the card on the coffee table and laughed softly, waiting for the apology. I told them the post office must have made a mistake, because my invitation didn't have my name on it. The silence that followed wasn't the awkward silence of a mistake realized. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a decision made. Chloe didn't even look up from her magazine at first. She just smoothed a lace sample and said that there hadn't been a mistake. She told me that they had talked about it extensively, and decided it was better if I didn't attend the ceremony or the reception. I looked at Liam, waiting for him to jump in, to tell her she was being ridiculous. He just stared at his shoes. I asked why. I asked if I had done something to offend them during my recovery. Chloe finally looked at me, and her eyes were as cold as a surgeon's scalpel. She told me that this was a high-end black tie event, and they were going for a very specific, joyful aesthetic. She said that having me there, with my visible exhaustion and the way I limped, would be a constant medical reminder of the dark times. She actually told me that my presence would make her feel guilty on her big day. And she didn't want to look at me and feel the emotional weight of what had happened. She wanted a fresh start, and apparently I was a walking, breathing monument to a past she wanted to bury. I felt the blood rush to my face, my pulse hammering against the very spot where they had cut me open. I turned to Liam and asked him if he was really okay with this. I asked him if he understood that I had literally gone under the knife so he could even live to see this wedding day. He wouldn't look at me. He just muttered something about how Chloe had a vision for the day, and he didn't want to cause any drama. He said he hoped I could be selfless enough to let them have their moment without making it about my sacrifice. He chose her aesthetic over the person who had given him back his life. He stayed silent while she insulted the very scars I bore for his sake. The betrayal felt like a second surgery, one performed without any numbing agent. I walked out of that house feeling smaller than I ever had, my hand instinctively clutching my side where the phantom pain was now eclipsed by a very real ache in my chest. I thought that was the bottom. I was wrong. I didn't realize they weren't just excluding me, they were using my recovery money to pay for the florist. The drive home was a blur of tunnel vision and shallow breaths. For years, I had operated on the philosophy that family doesn't keep score. I had lived my life as a perpetual open tab, convinced that my generosity was the glue holding our fractured lineage together. But as I sat in my darkened living room, the throbbing in my side felt less like a surgical recovery and more like a physical manifestation of my own stupidity. I realized that as long as I played the saint, they would continue to treat me like a martyr. It was time to stop being the family savior and start being the one person I had neglected for a decade. An accountant. I opened my laptop and logged into our shared family cloud drive. It was a digital relic from 3 years ago, created when Liam first got sick so we could coordinate his care. Back then, I was the one depositing funds for his rent, his car insurance, and his mounting medical copays. I had told myself it was a loan, then a gift, then simply a necessity. If he lost his apartment, he couldn't recover. If he lost his car, he couldn't get to dialysis. I had poured my savings into his survival, as if I were stoking a fire that refused to catch. I began to pull the bank statements, my eyes scanning past my own name and landing on the consistent, bleeding outflows of cash. For 36 months, I had covered his basic existence. I looked at the rent transfers, $1,500 every single month like clockwork. I looked at the insurance premiums and the emergency payments for groceries and utilities. I had been the invisible scaffolding holding up the facade of his life. I felt a cold, metallic numbness settle over me as the numbers began to stack up. It wasn't just money, it was my 20s. It was the vacations I never took, the house deposit I never made, and the retirement fund that sat stagnant while I kept him afloat. Then I saw a folder I hadn't noticed before, tucked inside a subdirectory labeled Liam Medical Archive. It was titled, quite simply, Wedding Fund. My heart did a slow, painful roll in my chest. I clicked it open, expecting to see their savings. Instead, I found a meticulous spreadsheet tracking the surplus from the medical donations and the direct support I had provided. During the 6 months leading up to the transplant, I had given Liam an extra $10,000 specifically for post-operative complications and emergency care. I wanted him to have a safety net so he wouldn't have to stress about money while his body accepted my organ. As I scrolled through the entries, the bile rose in my throat. Every penny of that emergency money had been diverted. There were line items for a premium open bar, a designer tuxedo rental, and a deposit for a videographer who specialized in cinematic love stories. They hadn't saved a dime of their own money. They had simply taken the cash I gave them to keep Liam alive and used it to fund the very event I was now banned from attending. They were literally partying on the back of my survival fund. I began to build my own spreadsheet. I didn't just list the big transfers, I went back to the beginning. I accounted for the 3 years of rent, the accumulated interest on the personal loans I'd taken out to cover his bills when my own accounts ran dry, and the exact cost of the wages I lost during my 2-month recovery period. I factored in the private nursing care I paid for so my mother wouldn't have to exhaust herself. I was no longer looking at my brother. I was looking at a massive unhedged liability. I sat back, the blue light of the screen reflecting in my eyes, and stared at the final figure. I had spent years thinking I was building a bridge to carry my brother to safety. In reality, I had been building a palace for a king who intended to lock the gates the moment the roof was finished. I saw the total at the bottom of the spreadsheet. It wasn't just a few thousand. It was life-changing. It was the cost of a comfortable life that I had handed over to a man who thought I wasn't aesthetic enough to stand in his presence. And then I saw the text log from Chloe to my mother, backed up to the shared drive by mistake. I sat in my parents' living room, the same room where we had shared a tearful dinner the night before my surgery. Back then the air was thick with a heavy reverent gratitude. My mother had held my hands and called me her miracle worker. My father had looked at me with a pride so intense it felt like a physical weight. But as I sat there now, with the printed spreadsheet of Liam's wedding fund resting on the coffee table, the atmosphere had shifted into something clinical and defensive. I waited for the explosion of maternal fury, for my father to stand up and demand that Liam fix this insult. I waited for the people who raised me to defend the person who had just sacrificed a part of his body for their other son. Instead, my mother didn't even look at the paper. She just sighed, a long weary sound that made me feel like I was the one being difficult. She told me that I needed to understand how much pressure Liam and Chloe were under. She said that a wedding is a fragile thing, a day meant for perfection, and that if Chloe felt that my presence would bring back the trauma of the hospital, then perhaps I should respect that. She used the word trauma to describe the sight of me, the person who had actually endured the trauma, as if my very existence was a burden on the bride's delicate sensibilities. I turned to my father, expecting him to be the voice of reason. He just cleared his throat and looked out the window. He told me that I had already done such a noble thing by giving Liam the kidney, and that it would be a shame to tarnish that legacy by causing a scene now. He actually suggested that by making an issue of the invitation, I was being selfish. He told me to be the bigger person, a phrase that has always been used in our family as code for, be the person who accepts the abuse, so we don't have to deal with the conflict. The contrast was staggering. Liam was the golden child whose happiness had to be protected at any cost, even if that cost was the dignity of the brother who had saved him. I was the disposable donor, a biological spare part that had served its purpose and could now be discarded because I didn't fit the color scheme of the reception. They weren't just asking me to miss a party. They were asking me to accept that my value ended the moment the transplant was successful. They were perfectly happy to let me sit at home alone, recovering from a major operation, while they celebrated a life that I had provided, using money that I had earned. When I pointed out that Chloe was using my medical recovery fund to pay for her lilies and her lace, my mother waved her hand dismissively. She said that once money is given, it belongs to the receiver, and that I shouldn't be so petty about the details. She told me that Liam deserved a beautiful day after all he had been through, completely ignoring what I was currently going through. The entitlement was a family sickness, a rot that started at the top and flowed straight down to Liam. I realized then that I wasn't just fighting my brother. I was fighting a system that viewed me as a utility, rather than a human being. I stood up, picking up my spreadsheet. My side gave a sharp, biting pang, a physical reminder of the debt that would never be acknowledged. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just felt a cold, crystalline clarity settle over me. If they wanted to treat this like a business arrangement where I provided a service and then disappeared, then we would play by those rules. If my presence was too heavy for their celebration, then my financial support was surely too heavy for their lifestyle. I looked at my parents who were already looking past me, probably wondering if they could get me to pay for the rehearsal dinner too. Fine. If I'm not family, then I'm a creditor. It was time to stop the family discount on Liam's life. I went home and sat at my desk not as a brother, but as a ghost haunting my own life. There is a specific kind of silence that follows a betrayal of this magnitude. A quiet, humming coldness that makes your movements precise and your mind terrifyingly sharp. I didn't feel anger anymore. I felt like a technician dismantling a machine that had been designed to drain me. I logged into my bank portal and viewed the long list of recurring authorizations that kept Liam's world spinning. It was a staggering architecture of dependence. The first move was the apartment. The lease for the place Liam and Chloe called home was in my name. I had signed it when his credit was ruined by medical debt. I called the landlord. I didn't explain the family drama. I simply told him that I was exercising the early termination clause in my contract. I paid the penalty fee without blinking. It was a small price to pay to watch their floor disappear. I told the landlord that as of 30 days from now, I was no longer responsible for the occupants. If they wanted to stay, they would have to pass a credit check that I knew for a fact Liam would fail. Next was the car. It was a sleek silver sedan that Chloe loved to post on her social media, usually with captions about blessings and new beginnings. The car was co-signed by me, and the primary insurance policy was tied to my clean driving record. More importantly, the vehicle was equipped with a remote disable feature through the financing company, a safety measure I'd insisted on when Liam's health made his driving unpredictable. I called the company and reported that the primary driver was no longer authorized to use the vehicle under my policy. I clicked the button to initiate the immobilization. I imagined the car sitting in their driveway, a shiny, expensive paperweight that wouldn't even acknowledge the turn of a key. Then I reached for the most painful lever. Liam's anti-rejection medications were astronomical in price. Because he was still recovering and unemployed, I had set up an automatic payment with the specialty pharmacy. It was a revolving credit line in my name. The agreement had been simple. I would cover the first 3 months to ensure the kidney took, and he would pay me back once his disability insurance settled. He had received that settlement check 3 weeks ago. Instead of paying me back, he had bought Chloe a designer veil. I called the pharmacy and closed the account. I told them the patient would be providing his own insurance and payment method from now on. Without my backing, those pills would cost him thousands out of pocket, effective immediately. I sat back and watched the pending status on my screen turn to cancelled. I thought about Chloe's comment about my aesthetic. I thought about the way she looked at my surgery scars as if they were a stain on her perfect life. I pulled up her Instagram profile, seeing a picture of her and Liam smiling in front of the car I had just disabled. I whispered to the empty room, "You want an aesthetic wedding, Chloe? Hope you like the aesthetic of a repossession tow truck." This was the financial extraction. I was pulling the thread, and I knew the whole tapestry was about to unravel. I had spent 3 years building a safety net for a man who didn't think I was worth a seat at his table. Now I was folding that net and taking it home with me. I wasn't being petty, I was being accurate. If I was a medical reminder of his weakness, then it was only fair that he experience what life looked like without the person who had mitigated that weakness. I waited. I knew the digital ecosystem of their lives would start sending out alerts almost instantly. A car that won't start, a lease termination notice in the inbox, a pharmacy notification about a declined credit card. It was a series of time charges that would blow holes in their curated reality. I felt a strange, detached peace as I closed my laptop. I had done my job as a brother. Now I was doing my job as a creditor. The phone calls started within an hour. My screen lit up with Liam's name, then my mother's, then Chloe's. I didn't answer. I just watched the vibrations move my phone across the desk. But the real explosion happened when the wedding venue's final payment bounced. I spent the next 48 hours in a state of cold, clinical focus. The emotional part of my brain, the part that remembered teaching Liam how to ride a bike and the part that wept when his kidney function dropped to 5%, had been cauterized. In its place was a calculating machine. I sat at my dining table, surrounded by 3 years of bank statements, tax returns, and medical bills. The light from my desk lamp felt like an interrogation beam, as I meticulously reconstructed the financial history of my brother's survival. I wasn't just looking for the big numbers. I was looking for the thousands of tiny leaks where my future had bled out to sustain his. I drafted a document that I titled, Invoice for Life Services and Financial Restitution. I made it look as formal as a summons. I wanted it to have the same weight as the save the date they had sent me. A physical manifestation of a reality they preferred to ignore. I started with the direct support. Rent for 36 months. $54,000 of which he had paid zero. Car insurance premiums. $4,200. Utilities, grocery stipends, and the medical emergency fund that had magically transformed into a wedding floral budget, another $12,000. Then I moved to the costs associated with the transplant itself. I calculated my lost wages from my 6-week recovery period, the vacation days I was forced to burn, and the out-of-pocket costs for the private nursing care I had secured for our mother so she wouldn't have to strain her back lifting me. I even included the cost of the specialized diet and supplements I had to take for 6 months prior to the surgery to ensure my kidney was in peak condition for him. When I hit the total key, the number staring back at me was $45,682. That didn't even account for the literal organ I had handed over. That was just the cash. I printed 5 copies. One for Liam, one for Chloe, one for my parents, and one for Chloe's parents, who had spent the last month bragging on Facebook about the fairy tale wedding their daughter was having. I wanted everyone to see the receipts. I wanted the aesthetic of their perfect union to be stained by the ink of their actual debts. I drove to the post office and sent them all via certified mail, requiring a signature. I wanted to imagine the moment the mail carrier handed them those envelopes, the physical weight of my sacrifice finally landing in their hands. The fallout was instantaneous. My phone, which I had kept on silent, looked like a panicked heart, pulsing with notifications. My mother was the first to break through. She didn't call to apologize for the uninvitation, or to explain the diverted funds. She called to scream. She told me I was a monster for charging my own brother for his life. She said that family doesn't send invoices and that I was trying to buy my way back into a wedding where I wasn't wanted. She claimed that my greed was overshadowing the gift I had given, and that she didn't recognize the cold, heartless person I had become. My father echoed her in the background, his voice a muffled roar about how I was dishonoring the sanctity of family. I let her finish. I waited for the silence on the other end, the heavy, expectant pause where I was supposed to break down and apologize for being petty. I felt the scar on my side itch, a phantom pull of the stitches that had long since dissolved. I thought about Liam sitting in a car that wouldn't start, Chloe looking at a venue she couldn't pay for, and the two of them realizing that the medical reminder they wanted to ban was actually the only thing keeping their world from collapsing. My voice was steady when I finally spoke. I told her that I agreed with her. I told her that family shouldn't keep score, and for 3 years I hadn't. I told her I had been happy to be a brother, to be a donor, and to be a silent benefactor as long as the relationship was based on mutual respect and love. But the moment Liam decided I wasn't aesthetic enough to stand at his altar, he had unilaterally changed the terms of our agreement. He didn't want a brother. He wanted a donor who stayed in the shadows. He didn't want a family member. He wanted a line of credit. I told her that if I was being treated as a vendor who provided a service, then I expected to be paid like one. I explained that I wasn't the one who broke the family bond. I was just the one who finally acknowledged it was gone. My response was a cold, hard truth that left her speechless. I told her, I'm just following the business-only relationship he started when he uninvited me. I hung up before she could start crying. I knew the next phase wouldn't be a phone call. It would be a confrontation. I knew that when people like Liam and Chloe are backed into a corner by the truth of their own entitlement, they don't apologize. They attack. I sat in my living room and waited for the sound of tires on my driveway. I knew they were coming. The sound of the buzzer wasn't a request. It was an assault. They didn't wait for me to answer the intercom. Someone must have let them into the building, because 3 minutes later, the heavy pounding on my apartment door threatened to take it off its hinges. I checked my security camera feed. Liam looked frantic, his face flushed with a healthy color that my biology had provided him. Chloe was vibrating with a theatrical sort of rage, clutching a designer handbag that probably cost more than the anti-rejection meds I had just cut off. I opened the door just enough to lean against the frame, my face a mask of weary indifference. Before I could even speak, the screaming started. Chloe began shrieking about the wedding venue, about how I had embarrassed her in front of the coordinator, and how I was a pathetic, jealous loser trying to ruin the happiest day of her life. Liam stood behind her, nodding, his eyes darting around the hallway to see if any neighbors were watching. He looked at me not with gratitude, but with a pure, unadulterated resentment. It was the look a debtor gives a loan shark. I asked them simply if they had the money I was owed. That was the trigger. Chloe lunged forward, her hand whistling through the air in a jagged arc intended for my face. I didn't flinch. I just reached out and caught her wrist midair. My grip wasn't violent, but it was absolute. I felt the hollow click of her expensive bracelets against my palm. She gasped, her eyes widening as she realized that the disposable donor wasn't playing the part of the doormat anymore. Liam finally found his voice, but it wasn't the voice of the brother I grew up with. He stepped closer, his teeth clenched. He told me that I was a freak for thinking that giving him a kidney gave me a season pass to his life. He spat out the words, telling me that he had hated every second of having to be nice to me for the last 3 years. He admitted, with a chilling lack of shame, that he only humored my boring savior complex stories because he knew he needed my match and my money. He told me that the moment the staples were out of his side, he was done with me. He said I was nothing but a biological necessity that had outlived its usefulness. It was the mask-off moment I had been waiting for. The pretense of family was gone, replaced by the ugly reality of his entitlement. I looked past them and saw Marcus, the night security guard, standing at the end of the hallway. He had his hand on his belt, and the small green light of his body cam was glowing steadily. He had heard everything. He had seen the assault. He had recorded the admission of a man who had used his own brother like a livestock organ farm. I let go of Chloe's wrist. She stumbled back, rubbing her arm as if I had burned her. I told Liam that I was glad he finally said it out loud. It made the next few months of litigation much easier for my conscience. I told them both to leave before I had Marcus call the police to escort them out for trespassing and attempted assault. I told them that their aesthetic was looking a little ragged around the edges. Chloe turned to leave, her heels clicking sharply on the tile. She stopped at the elevator and screamed back at me that I was nothing. She told me I could send all the invoices I wanted, but I couldn't stop the wedding. She said the ceremony was happening in 4 days, and there wasn't a thing I could do to take that joy away from them. I leaned against my doorframe, feeling the cold air from the hallway on my face. I gave them a small tight smile that didn't reach my eyes. I told her, I don't have to. The bank already did. The morning after the hallway confrontation, I sat in a sterile glass-walled office that overlooked the city. Across from me was Sarah, a litigator who specialized in family-adjacent financial disputes. I had handed her the body cam footage from Marcus and the thick binder of my itemized audit. She didn't look at me with the pity my parents used. She looked at the documents with the cold precision of a hunter. After 40 minutes of silence, she closed the folder and leaned back. She told me that from a legal standpoint I wasn't just a disgruntled sibling. I was a victim of a sophisticated, multi-year financial exploitation. Because I had never officially transferred the title of the car, and because the lease for their apartment remained solely in my name, Sarah confirmed that Liam and Chloe were essentially high-end squatters. I had the legal right to change the locks and have the vehicle towed as a stolen asset the moment I revoked my consent. But it was the wedding fund that really caught her interest. She explained the concept of promissory estoppel, the idea that I had provided life-saving support and a literal organ based on a clear implied promise of a continued familial relationship. By uninviting me and admitting that the kindness was a ruse to secure a kidney, Liam had entered the territory of obtaining a gift under false pretenses. I also stopped by the local precinct to file a formal report for the attempted assault in the hallway. The officer who took my statement watched the footage of Chloe lunging at me. He didn't ask if I wanted to keep it in the family. He asked if I wanted to press charges. For the first time in my life, I didn't protect them. I told him to put it on the record. Having a police officer validate my reality, seeing him nod and write down unprovoked aggression, stripped away the last of the guilt my mother had tried to plant in my mind. I wasn't the monster. I was just the first person to say no to their yes machine. Sarah drafted the final paperwork for a civil suit seeking the full $45,000, plus damages for emotional distress, and the recovery of all assets currently in my name. She told me that while you can't legally sue to get a kidney back, you can certainly sue for the financial bridge that was built to get the recipient to the operating table. We timed the service of the papers with the precision of a surgical strike. I wanted the legal reality to hit them at the exact moment their social reality was supposed to peak. The days leading up to the wedding were a whirlwind of ignored phone calls and blocked emails. My parents tried to stage an intervention at my front door, But I didn't even open it. I just texted them the contact information for my lawyer. I had spent 3 years being their primary support system, and now I was a ghost. I spent the Friday before the ceremony in a quiet park, reading a book and enjoying the fact that my side didn't ache quite as much as it used to. I was beginning to feel whole again, even with one less organ. I was reclaiming the space in my life that Liam had occupied like a parasite. The wedding day arrived. I wasn't there, but someone else was. The Saturday of the wedding was the first day in 3 years that I didn't wake up checking my phone to see if Liam was still breathing. I spent the morning at a quiet cafe, watching the sun hit the pavement, knowing that across town, the aesthetic was finally meeting reality. I hadn't just pulled the plug on a party, I had removed the foundation from a house of cards. Because I had canceled the final payment to the luxury hotel venue, the contract had been voided 48 hours prior. Chloe's dream of a ballroom filled with white roses and crystal chandeliers had vanished. From what I heard later through a stray cousin who actually had a conscience, the hotel had moved the entire event to a cramped, windowless conference room in the basement usually reserved for corporate seminars. But the venue was the least of their problems. 2 days before the ceremony, I had posted the itemized invoice for life services on my social media, tagging the wedding hashtag. I didn't add a caption. I didn't need to. The numbers spoke for themselves. When the guests saw $45,000 in unpaid debt alongside a band donor's surgery date, the fairy tale narrative curdled. Half the guest list simply didn't show up. People who had seen Chloe's posts about her blessed life were suddenly confronted with the fact that the person who provided that life was being treated like a medical waste product. The pews were empty, the high-end catering had been replaced by a limited budget menu, and the tension in that basement room was thick enough to choke on. The most satisfying part of the collapse, however, wasn't the social shame. It was the cold, hard math. Without my name on the lease, the landlord had refused to let them back into the apartment after the wedding without a massive security deposit they didn't have. The car sat dead in the driveway, a silver ghost of their former status. By the time the reception ended, Liam and Chloe weren't looking at honeymoon tickets. They were looking at a process server who was waiting for them at the exit with the civil suit papers. The image of Liam in his rented tuxedo, holding a stack of legal documents while standing in a hotel basement, is one I'll carry forever. He had spent so long pretending he was a king that he forgot he was living on a borrowed throne. By Monday morning, the desperation had truly set in. I received a notification from a local pawn shop. A friend of a friend worked there. Liam had walked in and sold both wedding rings, the ones Chloe had spent months picking out, just to cover the first month's rent on a studio apartment in a part of town they would have previously mocked. The gold and diamonds were gone, melted down to pay for the basic survival I had provided for free for 1,000 days. The collapse was total. There was no aesthetic left, only the raw, ugly struggle of two people who had burned every bridge while they were still standing on them. They had tried to harvest my life and discard the source, only to find out that the source was the only thing keeping the lights on. My parents, of course, saw this as my greatest sin. They didn't see the theft of my money or the insult to my sacrifice. They only saw the ruined wedding of their favorite son. That evening, my mother called me from the lobby of the cheap motel where they were helping Liam move his boxes. Her voice was cracked, trembling with the manipulative kind of grief that used to work on me. She didn't ask how my recovery was going. She didn't apologize for the things she had said. She just let out a jagged sob and told me that I had finally succeeded in destroying the family. She told me that no matter what Liam had done, no matter how much money was involved, he was still my brother. She said it as if it were an incantation that could undo the last 3 years of exploitation. She whispered the ultimate justice-sensitive trigger, the sentence designed to make me fold. She said, "He's your own flesh and blood." I looked at the scar on my side, the place where the surgeons had entered my body to save his. I felt a surge of cold, absolute clarity. My reply changed everything. I told her, "You're right, Mom. He is my flesh and blood. And he's been carrying a piece of it inside him for 2 months. Since he didn't want the rest of me at his wedding, I think it's time he starts paying for the part he kept." The months that followed the collapse of the wedding were the quietest of my life. For the first time in a decade, my phone didn't vibrate with a crisis that wasn't mine to solve. I spent my mornings focusing on my own health, walking through the park until my lungs felt clear and my side felt strong. The physical recovery was one thing, but the emotional recovery was a revelation. Without the constant draining pressure of being the family's fixer, I discovered that I actually had a life of my own. I bought the house I had deferred, used the money I reclaimed from the lawsuit to furnish it exactly how I wanted, and realized that peace isn't just the absence of noise. It's the absence of entitled people. Liam and Chloe didn't last. Their relationship was built on the luxury I provided, and the shared hobby of exploiting my hero complex. Once the money dried up and the reality of a cramped studio apartment set in, they turned on each other with the same vitriol they had once reserved for me. They were divorced within 6 months. Liam tried to move back in with our parents, but even they couldn't ignore the fact that his golden boy luster had completely tarnished. He's working a job he hates now, slowly paying back the court-ordered restitution, realizing too late that a kidney keeps you alive, but character is what makes a life worth living. My parents still try to send the occasional guilt-tripping email about family unity, but I've learned how to hit the delete button without reading past the first line. I don't hate them. I just don't need them. I've built a new family of people who don't see my generosity as an invitation to take more. I've realized that being the bigger person doesn't mean standing still while people walk over you. It means having the strength to walk away and never look back. I've stopped keeping a ledger of what I'm owed and started keeping a record of what I've gained. I look in the mirror every morning and I don't see a victim or a donor. I see a survivor who finally knows his own worth. I might be down one kidney, but I've never felt lighter now that I've lost 180 pounds of dead weight.